Hello, I am Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research, and this is the Wayward Sons Book Group, where we read and study the chapters as they progress through Wayward Sons, NICAP and the IC, a nonfiction book I wrote about the early days of NICAP and its mingling with the U.S. intelligence community. I'm joined tonight by Allison and Randy and Jeff Knox and Sharon Brown. It's great to have you all here. Thank you for joining me. How's everybody doing?
Doing well.
Good, good. I thought we would kind of summarize last week and maybe review a little where we're at, and then we'll finish reading chapter 6 and discussing. So please feel encouraged to comment, just jump in with any comments or questions as we progress here. So last week, we got to the part where the fundamental layout of NICAP getting incorporated goes something like this. The CIA was using an office that was called the Economic Cooperation Administration, or the ECA, to collect financial intelligence, economic intelligence. More importantly, the director of the CIA was Roscoe Hillenkoetter in 1949 that was doing that, who became the chairman of NICAP. Then the ECA contracted a group called Counsel Services in 1949 and 1950 to conduct international projects, at least ostensibly, about education and humanitarian and financial aid in China and Europe. And we reviewed newspaper clippings from newspapers.com about that. Then Counsel Services, we learned, had clients. They were a public relations firm in Baltimore, and they had clients including CIA officer Ulius Amoss, and represented people like him, and they represented T. Townsend Brown and the T. Townsend Brown Family Foundation, and had a relationship with Brown when Brown and two Counsel Services officers incorporated NICAP in 1956. So that's our general storyline that we have going. And one of the things that I got to thinking about this week about that chain of events was how somehow T. Townsend Brown ends up out. Like NICAP doesn't want him. He doesn't want NICAP. Something happens. Nobody wants to be the treasurer. We can only kind of guess why and rely on rumors. And Nicolas de Rochefort, who is almost certainly a CIA asset, was suggested by the executive committee to take Brown's place. However, de Rochefort himself deferred and said that he didn't think the committee could do that, and that Brown should remain in the position until the first board meeting in January, when officers are voted on and elected. So one of the things I got, that's a lot of questions to be answered in that chain of events there. So one of the things that I wondered about was that chain of events, like how did it happen? So let's look at some of this here. Welcome, Steve. Glad you're with us.
Hey, thank you, Jack. It's great to be here. Hi, everybody.
And here is evidence of what I was referring. And I'm going to be looking here at material that is taken from NICAP archives that were shared with me. And these are digital copies that were shared with me of NICAP records. And this was from that January 1957 first Board of Governors meeting, where they're accepting the resignation of Brown and wanted to appoint Nicolas de Rochefort as executive vice chairman. But de Rochefort called the committee's attention to the possibility it lacked the authority to take the action. And with further research, looking into it, they learned that they did not, in fact, have the authority to do this, and his appointment was deferred. So that's kind of just acknowledging that there. So I wondered, who was this executive committee? Like, exactly who are we talking about here? And I found that all the way back in a November 6, 1956 letter to Admiral Farney that we had taken a look at last week, where they alert Farney to how the officers are shaping up and what it looks like people's responsibilities are going to be. But they tell him that this Kendrick guy is already replacing Mary Von King, and that Thomas O'Keefe was going to be the treasurer, but he's out, and it's going to be D.C. Campbell. And they tell him that Brown, Heflin, Martin H. Heflin, and John A. Kendrick will be designated as the executive committee. And so these are the people that said, okay, fine, let's give it to de Rochefort if Brown's out. And looking to try to learn more about Heflin, we can see here that in the NICAP information from that time frame, they documented that Heflin is eminently qualified for this post. He is well known in national press circles and in the motion picture industry. So that kind of perked my ears up. I haven't done research into it yet, but I wonder how far from Joseph Bryan and the Office of Policy Coordination tree may or may not Heflin fall. So more research could certainly be done on Mr. Heflin. And they note here that Townsend Brown claims at his own request, he feels his qualifications are more in the field of science and not business administration. He wishes to resign as executive vice chairman, and with pleasure recommends Nicolas de Rochefort. that just doesn't correspond with what people say happened. I do not understand why they did not document more clearly what took place. And I do not understand why they were apparently complicit in concealing it, unless he did just resign and all this talk of funny business going on is just not true. I mean, that's possible, but at any rate, and then at the point this was written, we can see de Rochefort was appointed to succeed Brown, and a copy of his personal history will be sent to you within a few days. And the NICAP archives, at least those that have been shared with me, are noticeably absent de Rochefort and Carvalho's personal information. I'm sure that if it had it, it wouldn't have anything that we don't already have from the FBI, at least not on Carvalho. But for whatever reasons, they did not document this, which is a little annoying to me. It like in a hypocritical way of an organization that spent resources interviewing people about which direction the light in the sky was going and the wind direction and exactly what time of day, and make copies of the report and put it in books and like document minutia, just seem to want to skip over their origin story. And then here we can see John A. Kendrick was an attorney. And so he was helping the other attorney, Borzilleri, make a code of regulations. So see, again, here we have all of this official falderall that like they're like retaining attorneys to like conduct board meetings and write up codes of regulations and not documenting what's going on with their executive committee and what's taking place there, which is kind of odd to me. And I also found it odd that the strikingly confident Nicolas de Rochefort went to an attorney to tell him he did not have the authority to appoint Nicolas de Rochefort as the executive vice chairman. Is pretty interesting to me. And I found this, I thought I'd share it while we're at it. At that January meeting, the agenda included Carvalho heading up membership plans, and Kendrick, the attorney, was going to conduct an election for the Board of Governors. And see, these are the reasons people didn't believe that this was not a government organization, because people like Clara John that were interested in flying saucers just had meetings at community centers and at their homes to talk about flying saucers. They didn't retain attorneys to write up the guidelines for who's going to be the executive vice chairman. And there's just, it seems to me, as Rachel pointed out in a previous meeting, that there's just so much going on below the surface here, it appears. And I know Sharon had some interest in Mr. O'Keefe, so I thought I'd share this too. And I encourage those of you that find this interesting to follow the links to actually read through the NICAP files or the FBI folders that I link in the book, because I'll just kind of hit a couple of the highlights in the book or in a blog post, but there's often a lot of stuff that gives you deeper nuance and forms a bigger picture. And this is one of those things. It's a handwritten note. And as I mentioned, these are digital files, PDF folders. But this handwritten note is put in with it, which to me indicates that whoever scanned the folder just found this handwritten note like between some of the documents. And it says, I think Mr. O'Keefe should condense this to one page and make it similar in form to the TTB history, or the T. Townsend Brown history is what I interpret that to be. And what that's saying to me, what I interpret that to mean, is Mr. O'Keefe, the State Department man, part of his purpose with Counsel Services and NICAP was to polish these stories and to give these people their public persona. It appears that he kind of wrote T. Townsend Brown's history and how it was going to be presented. And that's how I interpret it. And like I say, I encourage any comments any of you might have about any of that.
Well, I'm just struck by how many people we've talked about are kind of like major players, like really influential people. Like the guy who was influential in the movie industry, and Rochefort, and just all these people just are so influential, and I just find that interesting. I don't know what it means, but um,
Yeah, I do too. And there's people, historians, researchers that know more about these people than I do, that this would not be a significant part of what they know about them. They're so influential in other areas. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah.
one of the screenshots you showed where it was talking about um, recommending Rochefort for the position said there was a comment in there that wasn't highlighted that said the committee had been searching for some time for a replacement. So it's like they had known for a while that they needed to replace Brown.
When it was like a week after they incorporated. Yeah, yeah. Like literally, I'm not even exaggerating. It was like November 7th, and they incorporated. It was formally approved like at the end of October. Yeah.
That's funny.
It is. It's wild.
Yeah, it's unrelated to the whole UFO aspect, but I was curious as well who that Martin Heflin guy was, like, just because one, he was in PR, and a lot of these people seem to be in PR, and there's, of course, a famous later UFO sighting by a guy named Heflin, and I found it interesting about it, his brother, Martin Heflin's brother, is actually a lot more famous than he was. He was the Academy Award winning character actor, Van Heflin, who was in a lot of movies in the 40s and 50s. He was one of the stars of the original 3:10 to Yuma movie with Glenn Ford. He's the shares billing with him up there. So his brother's a very famous actor. And I noticed that when I was looking at his obit in the Times.
Huh. And that's a great movie, by the way. Yeah. Interesting. Well, where we left off in chapter 6 was it's page 110 of the PDF. It's about midway through. The paragraph begins, let's fast forward to September 1971.
Let's fast forward to September 1971. Stuart Nixon is now the executive director of NICAP. He wrote Townsend Brown and asked him to submit an article about the beginning of NICAP. He framed the request in the context of preparing a 15-year anniversary edition of the NICAP newsletter. Nixon urged Brown to be as detailed as possible about how the organization was founded and his role in those events. Brown did not respond. Nixon wrote him again over a month later and repeated his desire to learn about NICAP beginnings. In his letter, Nixon numbered and posed 8 specific questions. How did it all begin? Who had the original idea? Who were some of the people involved? Were there any interesting experiences during the first few months of operations? And similar inquiries. This time, Brown responded with a 3-page letter. He claimed in an October 1971 response that he had not yet replied because he had been out of town. He suggested it was upon returning home he found the 2 letters from Nixon. Let me say at the outset, Brown wrote, that my files and records for those early years are in storage and not now available to me, so that I cannot give you detailed information as to names and dates. I simply do not remember some of the names of the persons involved. Brown went on to explain Clara John's Saucer Club helped with early interest and stated he personally chose the name of NICAP. He claimed he asked Major Kehoe to take his place running NICAP after continued operations seemed assured, a description of events that are doubtful and unsupported by the material we have reviewed. Brown's version of his apparent requested departure may not be particularly surprising, however, given its unflattering nature of him. It should be reiterated at this point that Brown worked for a few years prior to NICAP on his Project Winter Haven, starting as early as 1951. The ambitious, arguably wildly so, undertaking of anti-gravity experiments was described in a proposal he hoped to get funded by the Department of Defense. The large-scale project suggested the use of multiple collaborators. As mentioned earlier, ongoing experiments involved small flying saucer-like discs. For several years prior to NICAP's incorporation, Brown wrote further to Nixon, the Townsend Brown Foundation maintained an office on Connecticut Avenue and was engaged in preparing and submitting Project Winter Haven to the Defense Department. The program was intended to be secured under a secret classification, but was never approved by the department. Several radio stations gave NICAP some initial publicity, principally a station in Baltimore, Brown went on to explain. The Townsend Brown Foundation had retained a public relations firm from Baltimore in connection with Project Winter Haven, and that firm, it seems, was well known to the Baltimore broadcasters, and this accounted for carrying this news item on the Baltimore station. The foundation also retained an attorney, whose name I do not remember, in the same building where our offices were located, to file the incorporation papers for NICAP. The 3 incorporators were 1, the attorney, 2, the woman in charge of the Baltimore public relations firm, whose name I do not remember, and 3, myself. This clearly suggests Townsend Brown had an ongoing relationship with Counsel Services prior to the forming of NICAP. He indicated the firm was hired by the Brown Foundation to work on Winter Haven. We might wonder about the status of the arrangement at the point Counsel Services assisted with NICAP formation and presented the upstart organization with a substantial service contract. A number of questions arise, such as why Brown ever retained Counsel Services in connection with Project Winter Haven. Whatever the answers to the implied questions might prove to be, the circumstances are surely entangled with the rumors of misappropriation of funds. Brown's statement, his foundation retained an attorney to file incorporation papers for NICAP, is further evidence of blurred boundaries between projects and expense reports. An attorney on Connecticut Avenue appears to have indeed assisted with some various filing for NICAP, as indicated in the image below. The attorney does not, however, appear as an incorporator on the documents we reviewed and contradicts Brown's representation of the situation to Stuart Nixon.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's pause there and consider some of that. What are you guys' thoughts on why Stuart Nixon asked him these questions? Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I don't know. There's just one thing that comes to mind is, did Stuart Nixon know the origins, or maybe he wanted to know what the official story was or was trying to get at that?
That was what I felt. I know that these are a lot of names to keep up with, especially if you came into it new. I really admire those of you that are here just like supporting that I wanted to do this and stuff. I appreciate that. And the names like have no context to those of you that aren't steeped in UFO lore. Back near the beginning, we reviewed some work by Gordon Lohr, a man that ended up an assistant director in NICAP. And he felt like Stuart Nixon may have been a CIA asset. And Todd Zeckel certainly was quick to point fingers at the Jack Acuff and Stuart Nixon version of NICAP in the 70s to be a CIA errand boy type of outfit. I felt like reading that and reading this, that Nixon was wondering if he was a useful idiot to some extent. Yeah. That like, and I, especially when like he wrote Brown and asked him what the hell happened, and Brown didn't reply. And then Nixon writes him again. Waits a month and writes him again and says, "Good news, I haven't published my article yet. You still have time to respond and let me know." And yeah, I felt like he at least wanted to know what Brown's story was, because he had gotten this story from people before. I mean, Brown wouldn't be the first person he'd ask. And like we're doing, he's wanting to see how many discrepancies there are as you go from one person to another. I felt like, and Brown seemed completely vested in obstructing the story to me, that my files are in storage. I don't remember their names, you know. But we can pretty obviously surmise who he's referring to, other than he's just wrong. He's just like obstructing the participation of Thomas O'Keefe entirely, who was not an attorney, but was an incorporator. And he's just like leaving Thomas O'Keefe completely out of the story. And you know, he knew the name of Counsel Services. Like, if not their personnel, he'd had a relationship with them for years. I think you'd know the name on the checks that you're mailing, you know.
Well, and I also think it's interesting how this, and maybe purposefully so, maybe not, but the Project Winterhaven, like then leading up to NICAP, like that whole thing, you know what I mean? Like that they had the relationship for Project Winterhaven before that, and then.
Yeah, like it seems fairly clear to me that in some way, shape, or form, Brown thought that a relationship with Counsel Services would lead to funding for his projects.
Right.
And he thought that because of the kind of things Counsel Services was apparently doing with people like Colonel Amoss. And he could surmise that Amoss was getting significant money from angel donors like Clendenin Ryan, and de Rochefort was probably directly involved in some of that. But I think in a fundamental form, Brown kind of felt like if you hang around people where money's moving around, maybe some gets moved your way.
Yep.
And it's unclear what the CIA or the Department of State or the Department of Commerce had in mind for NICAP, but it seems like something pretty significant seems to have happened in that initial few days, much less 90 days. Who'd like to read next, or any other comments?
I just a comment, and I'll read if you want.
Sure.
Yeah. Again, I just wonder, like, where's all the money coming from? Like, not just for NICAP, but for like Winterhaven. Like, who's hiring all these people? I know in the letter to Nixon, Brown says, as far as NICAP's funding, that there were several people that became founders level kind of members at $1,000 a pop, including Brown himself says he thinks he was one of the founders that donated $1,000. But it's like, where's it come? Where's the rest of it coming from? And where's Brown getting the money from in the first place for all of his other adventures? Like, because by all accounts, like, he didn't seem to do much as far as profitable work and businesses.
Right. And that would be the reason to incorporate right there. The money would be the reason to incorporate a nonprofit, so that foundations, for-profit businesses that would see benefits of tax write-offs if they need a tax shelter, or if they're just generous enough to give a donation to a nonprofit rather than use that money for taxes, then that can be done as well. People will, of course, give money to a nonprofit rather than pay tax if they need. Like, that's why there's a push in December for your year-end giving by nonprofits. And that would be the reason. And being a nonprofit would have set Brown and NICAP up to be contracted and receive grants and things like that that would be the reason that you're not just a bunch of guys that meet at Starbucks, metaphorically, you know? And the extent, though, I hear you, Jeff, that the snowball kept rolling, that they had not one but two attorneys working on a code of regulations. And can you imagine that you've like got a man on retainer that charges what, you know, by today's standards, couple $100 an hour or something, to conduct an election for your board of governors? Like, it's really hard to wrap your mind around how this spiraled into what it became. And that was the beginning. like we're not even getting into when Kehoe successfully got congressional hearings on UFOs, and he clearly became a lobbyist. Like, that's what Kehoe did, was lobby Congress. Is that what they were wanting to do? Was, you know, the CIA, was the State Department wanting a political action committee? I don't know. Maybe all of the above. Like, they'll just use it as advantageous as things work out. But we touched on something last week too that I think deserves mention. We like go, aha, CIA was in the UFO mix in our current culture. Like, and like our context is books like Mirage Men by Mark Pilkington, Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks by Adam Gorightly, where we're like looking for that smoking gun, if you will, of here's Uncle Sam manipulating our UFO beliefs, when it often seems like what the public believes is just collateral damage, that wasn't the intent, but it happened that way. But it also seems like perhaps we're looking at it through a 21st century lens, and maybe, as we discussed a bit last week, that they were into flying saucer investigation was the cover story. Like, they weren't hiding that. Maybe it wasn't so taboo in 1956. Like, if the American public was worried about it, like their official FBI, CIA official stance on it was, we're not interested, it's not a threat. But we now know, as Jeff has talked about, there were panels and distinguished groups looking into it privately, that they didn't want to alarm the public. And that was one of the things they identified as most concerning, was public hysteria around the topic. It does seem like maybe like that needs to be one of the potential explanations on the table, is what they were doing was moving money around or transferring funds or transferring personnel, things like that, for coups and government interference and spying. And the cover story was what we're looking at today as taboo. You know, I kind of wonder about that a little.
It certainly appears Brown's fellow incorporators were, in fact, Thomas O'Keefe and Mary Vaughan King, each described as officers of Counsel Services in the 1956 proposed contract we reviewed. Brown rather notably omitted mention by name of O'Keefe, Vaughan King, and Counsel Services in his letter to Nixon. He failed mistakenly or otherwise to so much as describe the existence of Mr. O'Keefe. The employment resume of Mr. O'Keefe interestingly indicates he worked abroad for the Commerce Department during the formative years of the Office of Policy Coordination, circa 1948. The employment history gives no indication O'Keefe was an attorney, as we might suspect from Brown's description of the incorporators. Searcher documents published at the CIA online reading room using the term, quote, 1025 Connecticut, end quote, reveals a reference to the office of attorney Samuel C. Borzilleri. I strongly suspect this is the person referenced in the previously explored November 6th NICAP meeting notes, in which it was suggested to check with him about the Code of Regulations. An image located that was archived on the CIA website. Okay. CIA document search results included a September 1955 letter from attorney Borzilleri to the CIA Office of the General Counsel. The attorney advised the CIA of his legal interpretations on matters pertaining to rights and royalties of the published book, The Red Interpreter. His specific relationship with the agency is not clear. Townsend Brown's representation of events with Nixon were problematic. His 1971 narrative to Nixon has obvious discrepancies. For whatever reason, he failed to identify almost anyone involved while describing some of the roles incorrectly. The nature of Brown's description of the existing relationship with Counsel Services at the time he and the firm collaborated to incorporate NICAP could be considered intriguing, given what we can gather of extenuating circumstances.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's pause for a minute there. And yeah, the CIA had some type of relationship with Borzilleri. They had this that you can see archived as, and he was advising them on his interpretation of a book. So we wouldn't think that was an unsolicited assessment. You know, it would seem that he was someone that they interacted with, which is interesting. But going back to Mr. O'Keefe here, we can see, yeah, there, prior to NICAP, the last things he reported being involved in, apparently before Counsel Services, which he doesn't list, was he was a special assistant to the Secretary of Commerce, which is, you know, really interesting that the Department of Commerce keeps coming up and Nicolas de Rochefort's involvement with it. And he assisted other American republics in their economic, industrial, and agricultural development, including Guatemala, which is you know, I mean, what can you say about American meddling in foreign governments and affairs? And he was in 1951, he reports that he was assistant to the executive vice chairman, munitions board, office of the Secretary of Defense. And then he was a consultant on trade and finance and a member of the selection board for foreign service officers at the U.S. Department of State. And I thought that was extremely significant, with potentially with the clause in the NICAP contract that he and Mary Von King would choose and direct additional personnel. Like, as Jeff aptly pointed out, if you read the contract, Counsel Services is NICAP. Like, they're operating the organization, and NICAP is just an extension of it. Like, so yeah, you kind of had the CIA, ECA, NICAP, or CIA, ECA, Counsel Services, NICAP, at least hypothetically. Like you can see where Counsel Services learned that business model from like the work they did for the ECA and stuff. Any thoughts on that?
Well, from it almost sounds like the reason Counsel Services was involved in the first place was because of Townsend Brown's prior relationship with them. Is that accurate?
It certainly seems relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But as we wonder why, though,
Yeah.
like as a public relations firm, as an intelligence collector, like what did Townsend Brown think he was doing by introducing Counsel Services to Morris Jessup and the Cruckmans and Donald Kehoe? And what did Counsel Services think they were doing by being introduced? May or may not have the same answer. I don't know. And what did Donald Kehoe and Cruckman and Jessup think was happening? I don't know. But I think it all varies a little bit as you go from one perspective to another. Did you have more thoughts on that, Randy?
No, I had a question of how Townsend Brown got involved with Counsel Services, but you kind of answered that earlier, talked about the money and clients, and maybe he took note of that. So no, I didn't have anything else.
That would be my suspicion. I mean, I think that would be the most likely chain of events, was that he just saw them working with people that were getting money. They were getting a cut of it. They were sending out newsletters. They were handling things for people like Amoss. And I suspect he thought they could, kind of like a talent agent, I think, and that they might represent him well to the DOD or the places he might want funding. I wonder what they literally told him. Like did they make promises like that when they wanted payment from him over the years? Did he think that if he got NICAP to pay him, he could stop personally paying them? I don't know.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the first meeting we did. I think Stephen Greenstreet said, did he just cold call the Department of Defense?
Yeah.
And so maybe Counsel Services was he thought maybe it could be his in. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's like, yeah, I think he did. And I think it didn't work. And then he started hiring agents, I think. It's like that gets complicated, and we don't know. We're just kind of trying to surmise from what we can put together. But I do think an interesting part of this is what people like Todd Zeckel would take authority to tell you, and that they would like tell these stories confidently as if they were an inside source and here's what happened and now you know. And the historic forensic records just tell completely different stories from what even the general public thinking on NICAP is, in my opinion, if I'm gauging correctly what the UFO community typically thinks about NICAP. In fact, today on a website of a supposed news source for paranormal fringe stuff, they make a reference to NICAP and they refer to them, and I'll paraphrase here, I don't remember exactly how they word it, but like as a seminal UFO organization in the early beginnings, and did serious work, and no context whatsoever of any less than scientifically impressive opinions NICAP held, no reference to, people never reference the shaky beginnings and the apparent CIA involvement in literally launching the organization. The State Department man being an incorporator that sat on a board that, you know, assigned spies for foreign service. No, there's never any of that. And is that the main story? No, not necessarily. I think to me, it's more interesting, but you know, it doesn't matter what I'm interested in, but I do think it does people a disservice that if you hear a general implication enough, well, then like subliminally, if not actively, you end up with this idea that, oh, NICAP, back in those days, man, they really knew what they were doing. We need an organization like that again. And at best, at absolute best, the director was soliciting intelligence officers to leak classified information and suggesting that UFOs were interplanetary spacecraft under the guise of scientific investigation. And like I say, just today, I saw a website reference them as a seminal organization of the early UFO movement.
You want me to continue?
Yeah, this is getting into your forte now. Please do continue.
Colonel Amoss has at least one more interesting indirect link to our unfolding story. In 1952, the same year, the CIA asserts that DCI Smith expressed concerns about Air Force abilities to effectively investigate UFOs and took an interest in the in the use of flying saucers in their psychological warfare effort. Amoss gave a heads up to the U.S. Air Force about a UFO report. It turned out to be a wild goose chase, has some intriguing side plots, and wound up in Project Blue Book. The image below is from page 1 of an 11-page OSI file. The image indicates Colonel Amoss alerted the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base he got wind of a UFO sighting. The subsequent report documents Amoss claimed to investigate the sighting, at least to some extent. Wright-Patterson passed the info to the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and the chase was on. The report states Amoss claimed to have obtained the UFO story from a news commentator at a Baltimore radio station. The circumstances could easily be interpreted to overlap with Townsend Brown's later description to Stuart Nixon of the public relations firm he retained, almost certainly Counsel Services, being well known to broadcasters at Baltimore radio station. OSI interviewed the radio commentator, Louis E. Corbin, who claimed he heard the UFO story from a reporter he knew but did not name. Corbin told OSI he intended for some time to do a UFO documentary, so he was interested in the report. Corbin further claimed he had not released any of the information publicly and would not do so until authorities completed their investigation. He advised OSI, however, he was acquainted with the editor of a civilian intelligence bulletin, Amoss, on what would be his International Services of Information Foundation, and had informed Amoss of the story. Fascinatingly, the OSI special agent subsequently documented Amoss described Corbin as a reserve CIC officer. The Army Counterintelligence Corps was a Cold War-era intelligence agency made up of highly trained officers and later absorbed into the Army Intelligence Corps in 1961. When apparently asked about it, Corbin denied to OSI he was a CIC officer. He did state, however, he was a former intelligence officer under General George Patton and that he held an inactive reserve commission as a lieutenant colonel. Another intriguing discrepancy was Amoss claimed Corbin advised him of a specific father and son pair of witnesses, George and John Mason, that Amoss said he was unable to locate. Amoss added the address of Yacht Club Road, Riviera Beach, Maryland, did not check out either. Corbin, when directly asked about the father and son by OSI, claimed he was not familiar with the names. It was never conclusively resolved how the names even got into the story. Neither was it entirely clear why Amoss ever took up the investigation at all, much less alerted the Air Force to the third-hand tale. Perhaps he was interested in reporting it in his ISI publication. Maybe he was concerned about adversarial intelligence operations, or perhaps he was acting in an official capacity for unknown reasons. Curiously, the chain of events preceding the dramatic and much discussed July 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO reports in a few weeks. The work of James Carrion seems to deserve
Yeah,
mention.
let's hang on there for a second. Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So, what are your thoughts on that? I know you're familiar with that case. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so it's a really weird kind of like case as far as like the timeline goes. Like if you look at that document that was shared, the case supposedly happened at the end of March 29th, 1952. But the interesting thing about this case is that it was actually published in the newspaper in Baltimore in March 16th, 1952, a few weeks before the version of events that Amoss later tells happened. And it's clearly the exact same story. And this newspaper article in 1952 actually mentions the other two witnesses, the son George and his son John, who live at this Yacht Club Road. And supposedly, Mr. Mason actually talked to a reporter at the newspaper. He phoned in and talked to them and told them their story. So, does that guy really exist? I don't know. The newspaper claims they talked to him on the phone, but if stories are being planted in papers, can we trust that somebody really called him on the phone? I don't know, but there's two versions of the story. There's a story that gets in Blue Book, which supposedly happens weeks after, and then there's the original version of the story published in the newspaper in the middle of March. And apparently the story is probably a likely hoax as well, because the supposed two witnesses, only one of them allegedly even saw the event happen. And the other guy was like, I just kind of went along with it. And the guy kind of has a history of telling things. And, it's probably didn't even actually happen. Probably didn't even see anything. So it's a weird story. And how it ends up, a whole month later, with Amoss having the story, getting it from Corbin. Corbin acts secretive, kind of about, I won't tell anybody the names of the sources, until the Air Force investigates it. When the names were published in the newspaper a month prior already, so what's going on with this crazy story? I don't know. It's a really weird one.
Yeah, it is. I had a lot of empathy in reading the Air Force report, the OSI report, for the OSI agent that's like getting lied to by everybody he's talking to. And it's really an interesting read, whether you're into UFOs or not, to like read how this OSI officer systematically goes from person to person and then starts over and is like, tell me that again. Tell me again what happened. And he finds the discrepancies and he hones in on them until, like Jeff says, the one young man says, okay, I wasn't even there. I wasn't there. The guy said he saw it alone and he wanted me to lie because nobody would believe him if I didn't say I saw it too. And so now the agent is like, I don't think anything happened at all. I think the one guy just wanted to be in the newspaper and talk to women about his UFO sighting or something. And he was a young guy with a nice car, is why I make that reference. And like Jeff says, he had some history of things like that, exaggerations and things like that. And it's interesting how the OSI agent, from just like putting attention on them, just objective attention, gets them to start saying, nah, I don't even know what happened. And he never does really know, why did this colonel from intelligence agencies ever give a damn in the first place? And when he interviews Amos, Amos says, it's just a third-hand story. I don't really, I'll just tell you what I've heard. And at least twice, Amos told that man things that when the man tried to verify them with Corbin, Corbin said, no, I never told Amos that. And Amos claimed Corbin was his source. Now, part of the significance of all that mess is Amos relates directly to Counsel Services. He was a client of theirs. And I think the Baltimore radio station does too. I think that's probably the station that Counsel Brown is referencing in his letter to Stuart Nixon when he says Counsel Services had some relationships with a local radio or TV station or something. And I think that's worthy of further interrogation, is Counsel Services' relationship with the Baltimore media and Amos inserting himself in this situation, who really had nothing to do with it. And why wouldn't he tell the CIA about it if he thought it needed investigation? Why would he send the Air Force looking after it? Cause a blue book? I don't know. But there's a lot going on in this story. And it's another thing that the context often gets lost, and understandably so. If you don't know about NICAP and Counsel Services, and you don't know about Counsel Services and Amos, and you don't know about Brown's letter to Nixon about Counsel Services and relationships with Baltimore media, you really need all that background to go, wow, were they were they promoting UFO stories? Were they interested in them? Was it just the news? Like, if we looked around far enough, would we find that Amos was inserting himself in all kinds of things? I don't know, but it sure seemed worthy of including in the book, you know? I mean, it's a weird chain of events to throw on a pile of already striking chains of events.
Yeah, I wonder how how Corbin got the story. If Corbin was actually aware of the newspaper article from a month before and he was just being shady about that, or if this guy, was not happy with his 15 minutes of fame, maybe he felt that that small newspaper article wasn't enough, and so he tried to resell the story a couple weeks later to another reporter, updating the date to the new March 29th date, and then tried to push it out there again. I don't know, but that article was actually quite hard to come by. Barry Greenwood had a transcription of it that I finally got from him, and then I finally got a copy of an actual copy of the news clip of the article from the Baltimore American. And I mean,
Cool.
at the time period, maybe I don't know how many people read the Baltimore American, in that area at the time. So I don't know how well the story got out there initially when it just came out in that paper, because I could find there's no mention in any other paper. I've looked for it in any other paper, and it's just this one paper. And maybe he hoped he could just resell the story again to a new reporter, get some more attention out of it. I don't know.
Yeah, and the way he says that he's wanting to do a documentary or something, I think that factors too. Like we see a lot of that today, that a filmmaker or a writer will slap a hornet's nest to try to get activity and comments. They want statements from the CIA, from the FBI, even if they're not official, even if it's just former personnel or people claiming to be former personnel. And I can see how Corbin may have had an interest in wanting to talk to an OSI agent, because that's oh, this is cloak and dagger secrecy stuff to put in my documentary. But then he's denying that he's a former part of that elite military intelligence unit. And where did Amoss come up with that? Was Amoss just crazy? I mean, just out of left field, he says that. And at that point, OSI's not even bothering to check. We don't even care if you're former, CIA or not. We've just got a couple of spooks here telling UFO stories in newsletters and on the radio, and I'm just here to investigate if there's a threat to national security from this young man's UFO story that may or may not involve a UFO. It's a pretty wild story, and they all seem to have a mixed bag of agendas in it. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we proceed?
Jack, it's funny because it reminds me, it smacks of Fred Chrisman of the Maury Island incident somewhat. And even when you were saying, if we were to scratch far enough, would we find that he was maybe inserting himself into other news stories, the way Chrisman did with the JFK assassination and stuff like that. Again, just so many parallels. Loving this conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm right there with you. Yeah, would you please continue, Jeff, at the work of James Carrion?
Yeah. The work of James Carrion seems to deserve mention in this context. His books, Anachronism and The Roswell Deception, Carrion argues mid-20th century UFO tales may have been employed as tools to help break codes used by adversaries. He focuses on the 1946 to 1947 timeframe. The basic premise involves how an American intelligence agency might manufacture a UFO story through the use of resources such as its officers and media contacts. In the ensuing days, intercepted messages would necessarily contain details of the report, such as location, names of witnesses, and date. Particularly, the report carried implications to national security. Such might, of course, be the case, for instance, with alleged wreckage found in Roswell and announced through the official statement released by military officers. The near certainty such a story would be included in coded messages sent by adversaries would increase the opportunities of deciphering the codes given the keywords involved. Given such strategies, it might be considered intriguing the names and addresses of the apparently non-existent father and son somehow found their ways into the 1952 Amos Corbin UFO story that came to be archived in Blue Book. While I am admittedly speculating, it is not difficult to envision such a code-breaking scenario, or an occurrence in which the names were inserted into the story to see if and where they surfaced, serving as a tool to identify leaks and potential spies. An analogy might be considered tossing a dye pack into a sinkhole and seeing where the dye turns up. In the event you're wondering, the gist of the Amos Corbin UFO story was two Baltimore area young men claimed to see a disc-like flying object. An OSI special agent located the two, and during the course of his investigations, became increasingly skeptical for several well-defined reasons. Upon follow-up OSI questioning, one of the purported witnesses admitted he had seen no such craft. He said he was persuaded by the other witness to make the fraudulent claim. He added he agreed because he at first believed the claim of his acquaintance. The man had seen a UFO earlier that day. He said the acquaintance requested he fabricate his part of the story out of fear otherwise no one would believe the sighting happened. Eventually, the confessor came to doubt this acquaintance's tale. The acquaintance nonetheless stuck to his story and that they both observed a flying saucer. I recommend giving the OSI report a read, as it systematically documents statements of a witness and people of interest offering an anatomy of a UFO investigation and unraveling story. It is interesting from several perspectives, the presence of Colonel Amoss most certainly being among them. As previously stated, it is difficult at times to feel much confidence in discerning the intentions of professional intelligence personnel. I suspect the assigned OSI special agent could relate.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your reading. That's kind of wild, Carrion's theory. Erica and I have talked with him a number of times, and I really appreciate his work. That he tries to use forensic historic documents and research to put some practical reasons on why some of these things from a layperson like me's perspective seem inexplicable. And he kind of puts a former intelligence analyst spin on it and says maybe if a CIA guy's inserting fictitious names into a narrative, he's trying to see where those names surface later or use it for code breaking or something like that. Is a really interesting perspective, is it not?
Yeah, I find that fascinating. I remember watching one of his videos where he showed a newspaper clip from the 40s or 50s about UFO sightings, and I think it named 3 people who had seen UFOs in a town, and all 3 people had the same first name. And I was just like, what are the odds of that? That's so weird. So it's just fascinating.
Oh yeah, and I bet he was suggesting that then if a coded cable is sent and the powers that be intercept that cable, then they know they're looking for the same word 3 times. And yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Just it's incredible.
And then once you get the letters of that, you're off to the races. Yeah.
Exactly.
With trying to figure out the rest. Yeah, he has some really thought provocative work. He does. Who'd like to read next?
I'll be happy to read.
Sure, thank you.
We may have been left a clue about intelligence officers and such UFO reports within a 1954 CIA cable, a transcript of which is on file at the Office of the Historian. The message documents CIA assets in Guatemala were instructed to consider fabricating a flying saucer story to serve as a public distraction. If possible, the transcript reads, fabricate big human interest story like flying saucers, birth sextuplets in remote area to take play away, unquote. The distraction was intended to divert mounting public awareness of agency responsibility for a successfully executed coup. The CIA did, in fact, sponsor the uprising and, of course, preferred the Guatemala news cycle to focus on something other than its manipulation of the country's political affairs. The covertly backed CIA group brought an end to the Guatemalan Revolution, 1944 to 1954. A key CIA asset and aspect of the overthrow was the United Fruit Company, headquartered in New Orleans. In 1950, the United Fruit Company had a reported profit of $65 million, a sum 2 times greater than the annual revenue of the entire Guatemalan government. We find potentially interesting correlations in the employment resume of Thomas O'Keefe, an NICAP incorporator, its first treasurer, and an apparent Counsel Services senior officer. It states he previously worked as assistant to executive vice chairman in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His employment prior to incorporating NICAP and spending a month as its treasurer included serving as a consultant on trade and finance with the State Department, a career path strikingly and coincidentally or otherwise similar to that of Nicolas de Rochefort. The resume states that 1948 through 1951, O'Keefe was special assistant to the Secretary of Commerce, which included assisting other American republics in their economic, industrial, and agricultural development. Guatemala is among countries listed as a previous assignment where he spent considerable time. O'Keefe also listed his relatively latest previous positions as a member of the Selection Board for Foreign Service Officers with the Department of State, an assignment we can reasonably assume would necessarily place him in the company of spies and intelligence operatives. I frankly found it semi-amusing that O'Keefe, a man formerly employed on a board, at least ostensibly tasked with selecting State Department personnel for foreign assignments, was the inaugural NICAP treasurer and designated in the Counsel Services contract as empowered to hire consultants to work as NICAP regional managers. I strongly suspect Nicolas de Rochefort and likely Bernard Carvalho were appointed to NICAP positions in such manners. A search of government records suggests O'Keefe was indeed employed at the State Department, as indicated on his resume. In 1947, he was a deputy director in Washington. When declassified, the 1954 CIA cable inspired a 2003 New York Times piece. The article bore the curious title, Word for Word Coup Control. The CIA's cover has been blown. Just make up something about UFOs. The story about the CIA cable is fairly well known among those of us interested in, as Mark Pilkington and company put it, the Mirage Men aspect of ufology. Less discussed in UFO circles, however, are the people credited with the 1954 operation and their indirect connections to the genre. The National Archives reports notable individuals involved in the coup operation, titled PB Success, included former DCI Walter Bedell Smith and E. Howard Hunt. The State Department website has a 1952 to 1954 list of foreign relations personnel pertaining to Guatemala. Making the list are Smith, Hunt, and Frank Wisner, who you will recall ran the Office of Policy Coordination. By this time, he was the Deputy Director of Plans. The State Department list additionally includes pseudonyms used by each of the three. E. Howard Hunt, aka Walter C. Twicker, is listed as a CIA case officer and chief of the propaganda branch. There are also pseudonyms listed whose corresponding identities have not yet been publicly disclosed. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch to me to suppose the chief of the propaganda branch would be in the loop on a cable consisting of suggestions to assets as to how to manipulate public attention by way of a fantastic story about flying saucers or sextuplets. It doesn't seem like much of a stretch. It could have been his idea either. These possibilities are all the more interesting when we consider his apparent history in the OPC. Hunt worked for the CIA from approximately 1949 to 1970, or at least that's what the record shows and is a consensus among historians. He would later explain in his book, American Spy: My Secret History in the CIA, Watergate, and Beyond, that before PB success in Guatemala, he was assigned to the OPC. It was there that he worked on the political and psychological warfare staff for Joseph Bryan III, who became an ongoing staple of the NICAP Board of Governors. From page 46 of Hunt's book. Do I need to read this screenshot? Oh, no, you got it.
I'll read it.
Okay.
Thanks. At headquarters among the government buildings astride Washington, D.C.'s reflecting pool, OPC established 3 subdivisions: paramilitary operations, political and psychological warfare, and economic warfare. I was assigned to the political and psychological warfare staff headed by Joseph Bryan III, a Navy veteran and a writer. Besides me, Bryan gathered an interestingly eclectic staff, including writer Finis Farr, Philadelphia investment banker Gates Lloyd, Lewis Pinky Thompson, a New York and New Jersey financier, and Carlton Alsop, a former movie producer and Hollywood agent. All except Alsop and myself were Princeton alumni. The staff was soon joined by artist-illustrator Hugh Troy, who then formed another small coterie of political cartoonists and polemicists who would generate a large amount of material that found its way into newspapers around the world. And we're going to be going more into these men. There are so many levels of this story, like all of this that we've discussed about Counsel Services and Hillenkoetter and Townsend Brown and what was going on with all of that doesn't even introduce yet that Joseph Bryan III was a professional psychological warfare expert and a staple of the NICAP Board of Directors, and we'll be going into learning more about his activities and the Princeton men he worked with. And Alan Dulles was a Princeton man. And it's, you know, a whole thing that these guys were all looking out for each other, taking care of one another. I think I mentioned in a previous episode, Princeton University Library has the Joseph Bryan collection of records that were donated. I need to get that. I'm moving it up. Us doing this group is helping me move it up my list of priorities. There's some 500 letters in that collection that, you know, if you want to know what they say and who they're to and who they're from, you need to ride by the Princeton Library and find out, you know. And that was a pretty high priority for me pre-2020, and then the world changed and now here we are, and maybe I'll get back into that. But yeah, if you would continue now, please, Randy, and I am suggesting, thank you.
I am suggesting it is entirely possible CIA officers masterminded the incorporation of NICAP, or at least took significant interest in the developing situation. Perhaps Townsend Brown was utilized wittingly or otherwise. Nicolas de Rochefort almost certainly was. The game plan for the organization may have been designed in a similar manner as was the case when Rochefort acted as the lead man for the Committee of 1 Million. I interpret that if Counsel Services, knowingly or otherwise, was a resource for Office of Policy Coordination personnel before its 1952 merge with Special Operations, forming the Directorate of Plans, then it becomes all the more likely the CIA was involved in the development of NICAP for what might be any number of reasons. I suspect none of those reasons had anything to do with extraterrestrial visitors. It seems rather significant NICAP was incorporated by T. Townsend Brown, a man long in search of Department of Defense funding, who had peculiar ties to both the UFO and intelligence communities. Mary Von King, who ran a public relations and fundraising service with apparent relationships with Amoss, Rochefort, and Carvalho, and Thomas O'Keefe, who was seemingly an officer of Von King's company and a former State Department man that listed the selection of personnel for foreign assignments among his previous responsibilities. I doubt this crew's interest in the saucer hunting. You will recall Thomas O'Keefe held the position as NICAP treasurer only briefly. His successor, Duncan Cameron Campbell, described himself as a longtime employee of the Federal Housing Administration in Washington, D.C. Mr. Campbell quickly served notice to resign his turn at the position in December 1956, making 2 treasurers in about as many months. He apparently formally vacated the position by January of 1957. Shortly thereafter, he married NICAP office manager Rose Hackett in February. He seems to have tragically died in June that same year at his home in Bethesda, Maryland. The manner of death was similar to how Morris Jessup would die in 1959 in Miami, asphyxiation in a car. Years later, in 1971, then-Director Stuart Nixon apparently inquired to Dr. Garrett C. Rush about early NICAP happenings. Nixon's inquiry seems to have happened in the same general time frame as when he was asking Townsend Brown about NICAP origins. Perhaps Nixon was painstakingly preparing an anniversary edition of the newsletter as he wrote to Brown. Perhaps he personally wanted to know more about what had been going on in the organization he was now directing. Maybe he had some pretty good ideas what had been going on, and at least wanted to know what people would say when he asked them. Maybe a bit of all of that. The letter from Dr. Rush to Nixon.
Thank you. And yeah, we can see here that Dr. Rush, who was an assistant treasurer, informed Nixon that, Mr. Nixon, here is some information you asked me for and which I am glad I am able to supply. My appointment as assistant treasurer of NICAP became effective September 14, 1956. Mrs. Rose Hackett was married to Mr. Duncan Cameron Campbell on February 22, 1957. Mr. Campbell died June 6, 1957 at his home in Bethesda, Maryland. The cause of death was reported as by asphyxiation when he fell asleep in his car after parking it in his garage but leaving the motor running. I attended his funeral services at his family burying ground in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. Dr. G.C. Rush. So
Who exactly?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, can you remind us who exactly Dr. Garrett Rush was in relation to NICAP?
An assistant treasurer.
But, I mean, that's all we know.
At this moment, it is. Yes, one thing about the files too, I'll give them credit for, the NICAP archives are searchable and they're pretty functionally searchable. So we could search Rush and see what more we could learn about him. I don't know. I'll tell you too. You remind me to point this out. In order to do a FOIA request on an individual, typically to just ask the FBI for records, like if you have a file on this person or records responsive to this person. For those that may not know, they want the date of birth, date of death, full name, and place of birth, place of death. And if their birthday is less than 100 years ago, they want some type of death notice, like a that would be recognized by the professional research community, like a New York Times obituary, an obituary in a standard media outlet, which is, getting more and more difficult to define. But in years past, that would mean, New York Times, Washington Post, something like that. And so you put this stuff together, and you can pull some of the information. If you saw Erica and my conversation with the woman that does the Wikipedia work, you can pull information from there, and it can be very helpful. That it will tell you you pull up a person's Wikipedia page, it'll tell you a lot of that, their early history, where they were born, but you can't cite Wikipedia. You still have to find that death notice. Even if the information's not in the death notice, that's okay. You can pull it from other sources, but FBI just wants a death notice. Susan Gerbeck, it was bothering me. I got distracted there that I couldn't recall her name. Yeah, when Erica and I spoke with Susan Gerbeck, I was telling her how helpful Wikipedia has become for me in doing FOIA requests, that I pull a lot of the information from there because it cites its sources and stuff. And then if you just get, the write up in a Boulder, Colorado newspaper that someone recently died, then you're good to go. But the point in this context is, I don't know anything about a man calling himself, for instance, Thomas O'Keefe, other than he gave NICAP this CV, and he's listed in State Department records as having been a State Department employee. And that's there'd be no reason, for him to be in the Times or something like that. I might be able to find more information about him in newspapers.com can be helpful, but it usually has to be either somebody fairly well known, at least a minor celebrity, or you just get lucky that you find an obituary that tells you when and where they were born, And FBI will be fairly lenient sometimes. If you say, well, he was 73, so I guess that would mean he was born on or about, such and such a year in this county. Sometimes they'll let something like that go if you have the death notice and when he died and stuff like that. But like I'm saying, it can be difficult to just do a request on a Mrs. Rose Hackett that we're not even sure what her name was. I mean, how many, was that Mrs. Hackett before she married Campbell? and like what was her maiden name. And it can be difficult to find all of the other stuff. I just wanted to point that out for people that may be wondering, why don't you just shotgun FOIA requests on like everybody in this story? Because I think some of them are using aliases and stuff. And I'm not sure who they are. And as Jeff aptly points out, no, like I didn't know anything about Kendrick other than I guess he's an attorney that somebody said be the executive committee member for NICAP. And he said, okay. I'd imagine it cost somebody some money to get him to agree to that, but I don't know. There's a lot more research that could be done around all this. Yes.
Apparently, from what I could find, assuming it's the same Dr. Garrett Chamberlain Rush that lived in Washington, D.C. at the time, he was a prominent chiropractor in Washington, D.C. And his death did warrant an obit in the Washington Post. His wife's death in 1919 had an article on her in the Washington Times. So I guess he was a fairly well-known chiropractor from the area who died at 95 years old in 1980. So he was pretty old when he was responding to Nixon in that letter there.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Any thoughts? And I will go ahead and read these last 3 paragraphs of chapter 6. Mrs. Rose Hackett Campbell would stay on with NICAP after the death of her husband and work with Major Kehoe and Richard Hall, according to Hall. She was dismissed in late 1958 or early 1959, a circumstance he attributed to her devotion to the contactee movement. Kehoe and Hall viewed themselves much more as intellectuals and men of science, perspectives they hoped the public would adopt about NICAP. Before we continue our unfolding story, there are 2 more suicides to note. Wealthy philanthropist Clendenin Ryan, credited with using his fortune to fund turbulent political crusades, shot himself on September 12, 1957. The Baltimore millionaire and angel donor of Colonel Amoss, Des Fitzgerald, and the CIA was 52 years old. The same fate befell the former head of the Office of Policy Coordination, Frank Wisner, and I will pull his picture back up here as well. There is Frank Wisner. The man who recruited key personnel and ran the whole damn outfit would go on to shoot himself in the head with a shotgun at his Maryland farm in 1965. The New York Times reported Wisner had been ill for some time and shot himself in an upstairs room of his home about an hour after arriving there from Washington. His wife was downstairs when she heard the fatal shot. Frank Wisner was 56 years old when he died. They seem to be troubled souls, did they not?
Yeah, and this is why when in context of some recent history, this whole missing scientist or missing military people story, where a lot of people argue like these are strong military men, they wouldn't go out there and off themselves. So like, I'm sorry, it actually seems to be something pretty normal for strong military men to do when facing illness or serious illness or health problems, like to actually end their lives. Like, as we can see, quite a few of these people, ended up killing themselves.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. We were recently talking with Smiles Lewis, and that came up. And you need a large enough sample size with anything to be able to tell if something is unusual. Yeah. Like if 10 out of 10 people go missing, you need like more information about what kind of people were they, because obviously everybody doesn't go missing. Yeah, yeah. But go ahead.
That whole story is based on, like you said, not understanding base rate, the rate at which this stuff normally happens in a population, a group, and false clustering, just basically cherry picking like people from random, events, like, and realistically, for the population size of, like, say, scientists that work, say, just at Los Alamos, like, you should see a lot more murders, suicides, and deaths, like, than this missing scientist story has presented. So it's a bogus story based on not understanding, base rate and clustering. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, but it just seems like it would be reasonable to think that people in that industry would have a higher fatality rate than say school teachers. Like you'd have a higher rate of people that do get killed for nefarious reasons, even, than the general population, I would suspect. I don't know, I'm speculating here, but my point being that you still, you need a wider sample group for causation, where did he work before Los Alamos? Where did he work after? I've told this story on Erica's show before, but just to summarize it, I knew someone that was involved in UFO research, and they had become convinced that they were under surveillance. And I respected this person for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is because they went to an attorney and asked him what you do if you suspect you're under surveillance. And the attorney, having the experience they did with such things, knew some questions to ask them about circumstances in their life. And they had an extended family member involved in an investigation that led the attorney to tell them, I could virtually guarantee you that you'll be under surveillance until that investigation is resolved. And it's not always what people suspect it's about, it's possible to be involved in UFO work and still be, the subject of an investigation by an intelligence agency or a local sheriff's department or something for other reasons. Like Stan Romanet comes up. I got records of when they served him a warrant, and he started trying to tell the detective in charge that, Homeland Security knows I have secret UFO documents on my computer. And I kind of got a chuckle that the detective puts in his report. I assured him I wasn't there for UFO documents. Yeah. Like, well, no worries. I'm not here for your UFO stuff. And for those that don't know, Stan Romanet got arrested and went to prison for his involvement in illegal pictures of minors and things like that. Yeah, and so he quickly wanted to play the I'm a persecuted UFO investigator, and the detective said, "No worries, I'm not here for UFO records."
Not the only one to play that
Yeah.
game.
No, he is not. He is not. That is a disturbing trend in this genre, actually. But see, there again is the wider sample and the clustering. Does it just seem like there's more people with criminal activity, predatorial activity in this genre than other aspects of society? It seems like it to me, but I'd really need a sample of other aspects of society to be able to conclude that, you know.
Or is there something that's common that attracts them to UFOs and stuff in some way that makes a higher likelihood of them being in this group?
I tend to think so, yeah. And I think that like traumatized people and predators fit together in certain ways. And that's not to blame the victim by any means. It's just to say that, yeah, I think that's what's attractive to the predator is people that are looking for healing, that are emotionally vulnerable. And yeah, it can get real ugly real fast. Yeah.
I have a question about this Clendenin Ryan. We know that he was giving money, funding Amoss, and Amoss was a client of Counsel Services. Is it possible that he was also like funding NICAP at the very beginning, and then his death kind of took away a source of funding?
I had some suspicions of that, or people like him, or that was like why people were hitching their wagon to Counsel Services. Yeah, was that they were hooking people up, donors and angel donors and organizations, kind of like a community foundation might do, but a little more 1950s Washington style. I suspected that was one of the reasons I included Clendenin Ryan's story in here. Yeah, is I don't think that he probably was not particularly unique to Amoss and Counsel Services. Like, I think we could probably find a number of people like him if we look. Like, that's what the CIA did. Was I think that's why they were interested in Joseph Bryan as an asset. It's why they were interested in Pinky Thompson. We just read about being on Bryan's crew that we're going to get more into later in the book. They were wealthy, cultured men that were from wealthy families that could pass from one social circumstance to another well. And many of them were well traveled, and like knew how to conduct themselves in foreign countries and blended well, transition. That's the word I'm looking for. Transitioned well among moneyed people and from one social circumstance to another. And that's what the CIA did, was make contacts in those communities.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems plausible to me that he could have potentially been putting up money, because if you remember, I mentioned last time how when Amos was looking for a funder for this scheme to get Stalin's son out of the Soviets, he went to Mary Von Keen at Counsel Services, who put him in contact with Clinton and Ryan to, you know, get the money. So it does seem like she was this nexus to Ryan for funding various operations and various things. And he had a lot of money to fund a lot of stuff. He was the partial heir of, I believe it was $140 million fortune, which depending on, I believe I read somewhere, people estimated his portion of that was upwards of $28 million, which, you know, that's like 100 years ago money, like more than 100 years ago money. With inflation, that's, you know, he would have been a billionaire. And so he was
Yeah, and
hopefully
in the 1950s, we were multiplying it by about 10 times. So, yeah, that's just an obscene amount of money. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? Well, I really appreciate all of your attention and your interest in the book. I thank you for joining me. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can join us too. Send an email to jackbrewerblog@yahoo.com, and I will put you on the list to receive a free PDF of Wayward Sons, NICAP, and the IC that's searchable and has the links. And you can request to receive the invitations to the weekly Zoom meetings that are recorded on Wednesday nights. We always welcome more discussion and perspectives. Please visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org and take a look at our Patreon page. And if so moved, please donate at our GoFundMe. You will find all of the links, as well as to things we discussed in the show tonight, in the video description. Again, thank you all for being here and joining me. I appreciate it. And we will see you next time.